there's going to be a lot more rollups like us. We are the first, but basically rollups that acknowledge the fact that fragmentation is bad and try to become the Schelling point where all dApps can live. And that necessitates a couple things like local fee markets and fee redistribution. And instead of incentivizing app chains and then interoperating via shared sequencer, I think you're going to see a lot more very high performance rollups that can support the entirety of execution throughput that is required from their dApp base.
The Polygon Community Grants Program was launched with 1 billion tokens, all for Polygon builders. Season 1 is live right now and features 35 million in MATIC to support the next generation of Polygon projects. Builders on Polygon, these grants are for you. Join the aggregated future today by applying at polygon.technology/grants.
Pear is an innovative pair trading exchange built on top of Simio. Users can trade trending narratives with one click, from blue chip narratives such as long BTC, short ETH, right to the WIF versus bonk. The hat stays on. Simio's intent-centric architecture enables deep liquidity, source off-chain, and broad on-chain, and combined with Pear, has democratized access to complex trading strategies typically reserved for institutional traders.
Avalanche is a smart contract platform that has a novel consensus protocol, subnet infrastructure, and the Hyper SDK toolkit, which allows Web3 developers to easily launch custom, powerful blockchain solutions. You can start building today by checking out the link below. Nothing said on 0x Research is a recommendation to buy or sell securities or tokens. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and any views expressed by anyone on the show are solely our opinions, not financial advice. Boccaccio, Ryan, and our guests may hold positions in the companies, funds, or projects discussed. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of 0x Research. Today I'm joined by Ren and Terry from Eclipse. Ren, Terry, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
She's good to be back too.
Before we get started, I want to ask Ren, are you happy to be back?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I host my own pod at Eclipse right now. It's sort of like a go-to-market focused pod, and we also talk about like stuff in the SVM land from time to time, but I have missed you, Baco, so it's good to be back. And Ryan too.
Okay. We'll link to the pod below. Cross-marketing is apparently a good thing, so it'll be nice. All right, more seriously, do you guys want to give a brief overview of what you guys are building over at Eclipse?
Yeah, I'll let Terry take this one.
Yeah, for sure. Eclipse is a SVM L2. We are basically bringing the Solana virtual machine as a layer 2 on Ethereum.
So I think like the natural question here is why bring the Solana virtual machine to Ethereum? Like, why did you guys decide on doing that?
Yeah. Well, we wanted to make something that was different. And, if you come from first principles and you think about what type of execution environment you want to build out an L2 for, there's a couple important facets to consider. The first one is that the execution environment that you're building out should have organic traction and a large ecosystem of dApps and strong DevX and DevX infrastructure. So it generally has network effects. And the EVM is excelling at that. The SVM obtained that this cycle. Number two is that the execution layer should have some sort of very intrinsic merit to it, right? Like it's super fast. The contract programming language has a ton of traction outside of crypto, something like that. And so when we observed and thought about the trade-offs between the different execution environments available to build out a general purpose L2, the EVM was less interesting. And the SVM was really, it was the execution environment with the most organic traction, the most highest in production transactions per second, the largest number of innovative dApps. And yeah, like it uses Rust, which a lot of developers are familiar with. It has a lot of organic infrastructure built around it. And so that's why we decided to build on the SVM.
I'll follow up on that. I think if you look at the state of rollups and L2s today, right, they're not exactly like that performance. Even the most performant L2s only have 30 TPS. And if you look at Conduit's dashboard rollup.wtf, the total TPS across all of the L2s on Ethereum have a combined TPS of 260. And I know that like TPS probably isn't the best metric today, but it's still a metric that is like kind of useful for like comparison's sake. Whereas if you look at Solana and the SVM today, right, Solana very casually reaches probably like 1,000 non-vote TPS on a daily basis, day in and day out, and it's one of the most battle-hardened performance execution environment that we have today compared to any other sort of VM stack out there. And I think that's the fundamental reason from like a more quantitative perspective why we decided to use the SVM.
And a lot of people say that TPS is like a flawed metric, but it's only a flawed metric if you're disingenuous about it, right? Like, oh yeah, I'm benchmarking on pure transfers or whatever, right? If you benchmark on actual transactions, that's what users do. So then you want to, benchmark on what actual user actions are.
That makes sense. I have a few follow-up questions on the SVM. So I want to hear from you guys what the difference between the SVM and the EVM is, like both specifications wise, and like you already gave a rundown of why, but I kind of want to understand like how exactly they differ.
Gotcha. Difference between the SVM and the EVM. Well, first of all, a lot of people are contentious about like what exactly the SVM and the EVM are, but I want to hear talk about it as if it's the entire execution environment stack, not just like the virtual machine specifications. Largely, the two differences that I think matter when building out an L2 is number one, parallelism, which we all know about. The EVM is also adopting parallelism. The SVM uses pessimistic parallelism, which means that all state access and all accounts that are locked during execution are stated up front in the transaction specification, while in the EVM parallelism methods, they're optimistic concurrent. So basically, you run the transactions as if there is no contention, and then you have to re-execute later. So that's number one in terms of the differences. Number two is that because of those differences, the SVM, specifically in the execution environment, has multiple levels of local state contention or local fee markets. So the first of those is that in a Solana block, an account can only take up 25% of the block. That's number one. And then number two, there are multiple proposals where over time, there are fee mechanisms attached to write locking specific accounts, or like basically writing to specific accounts that change dynamically per account instead of in the EVM where there's a global priority fee auction, right? So those are kind of the two differences. They're not entirely differences in the virtual machine itself. So like the runtime virtual machine, how the stack and heap get allocated and things like that. But they're kind of overarching differences that I think matter more when it comes to, the user and how they interact with the dApp and how they interact with the execution stack.
Perfect. That makes sense. One kind of follow-up to this that I have is, and you guys go through this in your docs and on your website and like in other places, but why not Solana? And what you guys put in is that you want to be more, but I want to understand like what is more in that sense.
Yeah, a lot of people haven't taken advantage of the fact that as an L2, you basically have the ability and the leeway to get more performance out of your execution environment than in an L1, right? And L1 is basically encumbered by consensus, where a certain number of nodes, even if you do asynchronous consensus, where you just agree on the ordering of a set of transactions, people have to do that communication and that that basically like people have to communicate with each other and in the process incur some latency and incur some computation in saying that, okay, yeah, this is the canonical ordering of transactions. Meanwhile, if you have a single sequencer or a rotating set of sequencers, you basically only have one entity saying, okay, this is what the transaction ordering is. And in that process, you shave off, you fundamentally are a little more performant there. The other thing is that L2s rely on verifiability of execution, right? So L1s rely on consensus over the post-execution state root in order to enforce safety. But L2s rely on verifiability of the post-execution state root, which has a one-of-n trust assumption, or sometimes not a trust assumption at all in the case of ZK. And so if that is the case, we can then increase the hardware requirements on the sequencer side as long as we can keep re-execution costs relatively low, right? And so from an Eclipse perspective, our verifier, or kind of like our L2 full node, which keeps up with the tip of the chain, just downloads snapshots and reapplies data availability. So it doesn't need to actually have the same hardware requirements of the sequencer. And of course, like re-execution is one of them. So what you can do as an L2 is you can, push really, really hard on the hardware requirements of the sequencer. You can give it a ton of memory, you can give it a ton of bandwidth. You can even go into like hardware acceleration, hardware software co-design at the sequencer level, while still keeping the verifier hardware requirements low and re-execution trustless and permissionless. And so not a lot of teams have actually gone this route, but that's what we want to do. Solana is performant, but we want to throw incredible amounts of interesting research, optimization, and hardware at the block producer level to see what other optimizations we can get, how further we can get in terms of performance.
I would follow up there with a slightly more left curve explanation. I think if you look at the crypto landscape today, right, you see Solana and Ethereum are by and large two of the largest ecosystems, both in terms of user adoption and liquidity, in terms of like assets that are utilized or just sitting on a chain. Where traditionally Solana hasn't been able to access the liquidity of Ethereum, right? Whereas if we build a L2, we're able to access the God knows how much ETH sitting on mainnet, the $80 billion worth of stable coins on ETH liquidity while benefiting from the performance improvements of the SVM as a L2. And so I think just scaling rollups to an order of magnitude cheaper and higher throughput than existing L2s on Ethereum today, and B, being able to benefit from access to Ethereum's liquidity is just like a slightly more left curve reason of why we want to bring Solana to Ethereum.
Yeah, that makes sense. What is the rest of the stack made up of? Like, okay, SVM for execution. What else are you guys using?
Yeah, so it's SVM for the execution layer,
Yeah.
for settlement, which just basically means that we, post a state root to the settlement layer, like at certain periods of time for trustless liquidity and trustless bridging is Ethereum. The DA layer is Celestia. And that was because we needed something that was more performant than ETH. I think Dank sharding target data throughput is like 1.3 to 1.5 megabytes per second. And that's not enough to support even Solana TPS today. And so we needed something that was an order of magnitude higher, and Celestia provides us that. And then with the fraud proof mechanism, we hope to use risk zero.
For DA layers, are you going to be posting on one, like only on Celestia, or are you planning on doing multiple DA layers? I've always like wondered if, because it makes sense if since it's so cheap, but I wonder how you guys are going to approach that.
Yeah, only on Celestia. I think Celestia is going to be cheap for a long time. Celestia has the ability to increase block sizes while still keeping verifiability. So, yeah, definitely Celestia.
That makes sense. And you chose Ethereum as a settlement layer just because of the liquidity, or is there something else that you guys are interested in?
Yeah, in large part, it is because of the liquidity. Like once you include, the settlement layer in your chain derivation, you get trustless access to all liquidity on Ethereum. Ethereum is, where all the liquidity is, and so that's very interesting for us.
That makes sense. And what can I, as a user, expect different, like with a SVM L2 versus the EVM L2? What are like some immediate differences that I would face, apart from low costs and incredible execution?
I would say that by and large, like the user experience like shouldn't be that different, especially like I'm not gonna like amplify the fact that we have like lower costs, cheaper transactions, faster transactions, just because a lot of these L2s are like relatively cheap in the grand scheme of things, and all of them get pretty fast, like soft confirmations from the sequencer anyway. Eclipse is not gonna be different. I think one thing that is different is obviously the user experience in terms of like the type of wallets that they're going to integrate with. Since we're SVM L2, you're not going to be able to use like some of the wallets that you may be traditionally sort of like integrated with. For example, like Rabby, you probably won't be able to use that. We will have MetaMask snaps, we will have Salmon wallets, we may have some other Solana based wallets that will be coming online. So in terms of like the wallet user experience, it'll be very much like Solana and not that different. You will still have sort of like the same base fees, the same sort of like priority fee model. In terms of dApps, I would say the largest difference is that we are really optimizing for dApps that are truly are truly scalable within an ecosystem. Because if you look at existing L2s today, right, like if you find like a semblance of product market fit, you're going to saturate block space for a single L2, and the incentive for you there is to move to an app chain. Whereas if you build on Eclipse, you sort of have designated block space from the 25% CU limit, and the incentive is a little less there for you to become an app chain. There's of course other factors to consider in terms of like execution value, accrual, MEV, but there's ways to fix that too. And the user can basically expect this like, I want to say the intersection of various ecosystems, right? First, you're going to have the trustless access to ETH liquidity. So you will have ETH-based assets. Second, we will have bridging available from Solana. So you'll be able to access assets such as Sol, GitoSol, LSCs in Solana land, and also using Hyperlane and IBC. We'll also be bridging over assets such as like Stake DYDX, Stake TIA. So basically, the goal is to become this, I don't want to say centralizing hub, but just a hub between these various ecosystems. And obviously, there's a whole bunch of DeFi primitives that will basically flourish on these assets from these various ecosystems. Whereas if you look at the landscape today, I think it's hard to, for example, justify bridging ETH to Solana and then pairing like LPing ETH and SOL together, right? Like that's just kind of like a jank weird setup. Whereas like on Eclipse, that makes a lot more sense because we'll have both bridging from ETH mainnet and from Solana, and you'll be able to LP ETH and SOL together. So user experience wise, pretty similar to Solana. dApp ecosystem wise, it's a good mix of like Solana, like native dApps, some of them which are going to deploy in Eclipse, and some other Eclipse native dApps with a mix of games, NFTs, consumers, and whatnot.
Yeah, and one thing to add here is, the only reason for Eclipse to exist is if we can be an order of magnitude better. To the end normal user who submits like 1 or 2 transactions a day, it might be imperceptible. But we do want to bring latency down. We do want to bring costs down, and we do want to bring TPS up by an order of magnitude, if not more.
Yeah, totally. So, thinking from like, what's your go-to-market to get developers to build on Eclipse? And like, I'm thinking about this in the context like 12 months ago, um, there wasn't much going on Solana. And if you were thinking about building there, like one, maybe just like less competition, or just like your go-to-market was very different. Now, like Solana has kind of come out of nowhere. It's the kind of story chain of this cycle. There's a lot of activity there. So like you're now like competing with them, whereas before, like maybe 12 months ago, like you guys had like a very clear go-to-market. Like what is the value prop to a dev to build on Eclipse and not on Solana?
I would say there's kind of two ways of looking at this, right? First is capital has been like relatively sticky. If you look at ETH mainnet's like TVL, it's still an order of magnitude higher than Solana. And before the Solana haters come from me, I will acknowledge that Solana has traditionally seen a much higher, I think they call it capital efficiency, right? Like with for the same amount of LP, Solana sees like a buttload higher DEX volume, borrowing, lending, and DeFi activity. Whereas I still think like a lot of capital is going to remain on Ethereum, right? So for the pitch for like a Solana developer, it's basically, hey, you have a Solana dApp. If you want to try and give it a shot to access ETH liquidity, which is still an order of magnitude higher than Solana in terms of liquidity, while still benefiting from the same performance benefits that Solana and the SVM provides, Eclipse is for you, right? And then for slightly more like Ethereum based builders and Ethereum based dApps, the pitch here is that no L2 today probably provides you with the benefits of building a truly scalable dApp, right? I think a lot of dApps find product market fit first on one chain and then eventually build towards like this app chain using a modular stack. So our pitch is, hey, we're going to give you low fees. We're going to give you parallel execution so your user experience will never deteriorate. You will never have to sort of suffer from the noisy neighbor problem where one NFT mint takes up the entirety of block space and your users get priced out, the whole chain goes to shit, and basically your users suffer a really bad user experience, not as a result of anything or anything that you did. And so that's kind of the pitch to Ethereum developers. And to follow on to that, I think eventually we will get questions of like, okay, a dApp has been built out on Eclipse. Why would he not basically build an app chain, right? And I think the pitch there is that a lot of builders have gone towards an app chain route because they did not have sort of dedicated block space, and they basically get like pushed out of the block space, and so the incentive is there to basically control their sort of own block space. And the second thing is, I think a lot of ecosystem do dApps because they cannot offer sticky paying customers, right? We want to aggregate this to a rollup through basically like this interoperable ecosystem that's composable, where the sum is greater than the parts, and basically the value of staying on the rollup should surpass the value of becoming your own app chain, even for dApps that find product market fit. And I think that's one point where we want to differ on ideology.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Ren. Thinking about roadmaps, right? Like everyone's excited about things like Fire Dancer, and there's a dev team over there. They have relationships with Jump. Like the market knows that. What is the Eclipse like roadmap in the context of like or in the context of Solana's roadmap, right? Because like they have resources, they have relationships. What's when Solana ships something, are you guys copying and pasting? Like, are you guys going your own route? Like what's that future look like?
Yeah. So specifically in relation to FireDancer, Eclipse will adopt FireDancer when it goes live. And the FireDancer architecture is very modular. And there are many components of the FireDancer stack that scale linearly to, say the number of cores that you throw at it. Specifically, their quick implementation scales linearly. Their signature verification stack requires an FPGA, but they use a consumer FPGA. We could use something that's more sophisticated. The Anza is currently solving a lot of the memory issues that will allow you to basically allocate more threads in execution in the banking stage. And so, like in conjunction, we expect that if we are to use the FireDancer stack, which we will when it is available on mainnet, there is a lot of affordances by becoming an L2 and using the affordances of centralization of an L2 with FireDancer and an optimized Agave client. Otherwise, in terms of feature gates, yes, we will be completely mainnet compatible.
Got it. So when you say mainnet compatible, you mean like a SVM developer can easily copy paste their application to Eclipse and just it goes.
Exactly.
I'll add on to Terry there. We're going to be mainnet compatible, and we are obviously going to utilize a lot of the sort of developments directly from Solana contributors, Solana Labs, or like Solana client related teams. But we are also making a heavy research push, right? We don't really just want to take from Solana, we also want to contribute back to Solana. So whether that's like core validator client optimization and research there, or for example, tinkering with like transaction fee markets, we're going to be putting out a lot of research in the coming months/year that hopefully informs our own roadmap in terms of how we want to best implement the SVM and maximize its performance, and hopefully deliver that value back to Solana itself, or perhaps other like SVM chains.
That's super interesting. So are there any, and maybe we can't speak to it today, but are there any like design decisions that you guys are thinking about that are going to differ, or anything that you would do differently if you were in control of that roadmap?
One thing that we've thought a lot about is the transaction fee mechanism. And obviously, like Solana had a bit of issues with network congestion that were in large part because of cheap base fees plus incentives to spam. That is something that we're strongly considering. Like for one, our configuration right now makes us cheaper than Solana, and we are probably anticipating a lot more spam than Solana, which makes us want to think much more about adopting multidimensional fees, especially in relation to network congestion, faster, and especially in relation to local fee markets. Right. I think one of the biggest benefits of Solana and SVM L2, we can specifically argue, and Ren touched on a lot of these points, that it can be a selling point for synchronous composability within one L2 ecosystem, especially if you have value accrual back to the dApps in some certain way, like Canto CSR or a MEV redistribution, plus local fee markets, plus extremely scalable, like an extremely scalable L2. You can then argue that, okay, like all the apps can then live on this chain, plus interoperate with each other. And plus they have an incentive to stay on the chain. So like tinkering with that type of thing is also on the roadmap for us, whereas it is much more difficult for Solana to do that.
You kind of touched upon something I want to ask you about, and we gave Ren gave a really good kind of introduction to this, is like how you're going to onboard, but I think he gave more the pitch. But I want basically like the CSR is what you mentioned, which I think like did okay for Canto as an idea, but it never really did that well. I want to understand like what are some steps that you guys are going to take, because roll up competition is huge now, especially like onboarding dApps, and we've seen some good attempts, like the Big Bang thing from Blast was good. Do you guys have any specific programs lined up, or how are you approaching that in general?
Yeah, so Ren can speak about that in the go-to-market side, and I'm kind of thinking about this more from a technical roll-up construction perspective, right? Like with Pudgy Chain, one thing I realized is apps is reasons why. Well, it's very obvious that apps are the reasons why people go on chains, but the job of the chain itself is to provide developers and provide ecosystems and provide um, people with a reason to deploy on you. And the reason has to be that basically their revenue is going to increase if they deploy on your chain. And if that's not the case, then why would they deploy on your chain if they can get huge grants from other people? Like there's millions of developers that exist on Ronin, etc. Right? And so, from a technical perspective, we're thinking about different mechanisms that have been used. So, Blast did a sequence of revenue share, Canto did CSR, and then there's also like other ways that have not really been explored that are being used in the app specific ecosystem that have not come back to L2. Specifically, there's MEV redistribution. So like harvesting like non-malicious MEV at the sequencer level and then doing some sort of attribution back to dApps and then redistributing that. It's happening on sort of like the application side with things like Sorella. But no one has really explored and deeply thought about what that looks like in the L2. And that's kind of like a lot of what we're thinking about. How can we bring the value that we create at the sequencer level and best redistribute that back to the dApps?
From the slightly more go-to-market side of things, fundamentally, Eclipse is in the business of selling block space, right? Which means that we want to drive the most demand for block space. And I think there's a few ways you can do this. Like, sure, you can do off like the copy pasta DeFi primitives, like a DEX, a lending, borrowing market, a perf DEX, and whatnot. And I'm not saying that we're not going to have that for sure. We also want those DeFi primitives, and those DeFi primitives will be launching on our chain. But I think the way I think about this, which might be slightly different for other people, is that a lot of people often say like L2s or chains build basically A for like the vibes, or B, they have an existing community. I definitely agree with that. There's definitely like a chicken and egg problem. You want to see like a sticky community. You want to see a large amount of liquidity. You want to know that demand for your dApp and whatever product or service that you're building is going to be there just from like heuristics. But also, I think the real like 10x builders, if you build something that's truly breakout, truly drives value to the users, and is truly something novel, interesting, fun, engaging with high retention, people will bridge over to your chain, assuming it's not like insanely complex, like you need to go through like 3 wallets or something in like Cosmos, IBC. Then people will bridge over to your chain to use whatever dApp you have built, given that it's so valuable to them and it provides them with a lot of fun, happiness, or makes them a lot of money, right? So thinking from that principle, I think basically we are indexing more on people that can build out these standout / breakout dApps that are hopefully able to uniquely utilize the features of the SVM as an Ethereum L2, but B, also trust themselves as builders that they will be able to bring over the users.
I guess in large part, one thing I want to add there is I think what a lot of chains get wrong is that they are highly opinionated with capital allocation. Specifically, if you remember like the 200 million Arbitrum Gaming Fund. Uh, it's very difficult for a chain. And a lot of mistake that people make is that they basically invest in things that worked out last cycle, and or worked out in their near like memory vicinity. Right? Like, okay, like meme coin launchers brought a lot of activity to Solana, and therefore I'm going to create an ecosystem fund that basically invests in meme coins that are native to our chain. And but in a lot of cases, like what drives adoption and traction isn't necessarily like on my chain isn't what has worked in the past for someone else. And we want to be like incredibly mindful of that and be relatively agnostic in terms of, where our capital goes to and where do we allocate our time and interest to in supporting builders that are doing novel things.
I'll follow on with that. If you're a builder, right, you're building a product, the main thing that you want is distribution. And we're really also very cognizant of that. So whether that's us helping make ecosystem introductions, introing to VCs, helping protocols work with each other to create like positive sum games. And that's one of the very large reasons why we created the podcast at Eclipse, right? It's a go-to-market focused podcast because a lot of pods that talk to founders today just talk about like, hey, your product is here. Like these are like the flashy new features that you are going to announce in your roadmap. Here's this new thing that you launched yesterday. And sure, that's great if you want to like find out like what's happening. But then as a builder, I'm like, okay, I have no clue where this guy went wrong. I have no clue if this builder like had to do it all over again. Would he do anything differently? What were some of the key mistakes that he learned from? What were some of like the largest growth levers he pulled? And we basically want to drive value to builders, help them learn from it while simultaneously helping them with distribution and attention. And I think on top of like building like true standout dApps that don't just look at last cycle, what happened recently with a recency bias and saying like, hey, that worked. The combination of that will lead to a successful ecosystem.
Polygon Labs is developing the next generation of open source ZK tech to aggregate crypto liquidity and user bases, empowering developers to grow in a unified web of interoperable chains with the AggLayer. The AggLayer is a machine for network effects. Don't worry about bootstrapping liquidity, just build anywhere in the AggLayer to tap the liquidity and users everywhere. To support the aggregated future and bootstrap quality projects, the Polygon Community Grants Program was launched with 1 billion tokens, all for Polygon builders. Season 1 of the Community Grants Program is live right now and features 35 million in MATIC to support the next generation of Polygon projects. For builders on Polygon or projects interested in migrating, these grants are for you. Join the aggregated future and feel empowered to grow in an infinite web of unified, interoperable chains. Apply today at polygon.technology/grants.
Pear is an innovative pair trading exchange built on top of Simio. Users can trade trending narratives with one click, from blue chip narratives such as long BTC, short ETH, right to the WIF versus bonk. The hat stays on. Simio's intent-centric architecture enables deep liquidity, source off-chain, and broad on-chain, and combined with Pear, has democratized access to complex trading strategies typically reserved for institutional traders.
The age of interoperability is here. With the launch of Teleporter, Avalanche becomes a seamlessly linked network of many sovereign blockchains that communicate so smoothly they feel like a single chain. Teleporter is an EVM-compatible cross-chain communication protocol built on top of Avalanche Port Messaging. It allows any EVM chain on Avalanche to send messages, assets, and data to one another in a simple, fast, affordable, and secure way. Teleporter and Avalanche Port Messaging provide a new foundation for how Avalanche blockchains can communicate and how developers can easily build cross-chain applications out of the box. Build anything you want, any way you want, on the eco-friendly blockchain designed for Web3 devs. Check it out by clicking the link below. Ren comes back on the pod and just shits on it, man. That's crazy. No, but I agree with you. I agree with both of you. I've had like 3 questions over the past 3 minutes just because everything you're like, yes, but like also this. I'm going to start off with the MEV returns to sequencers with Terry, and then we'll go on from there. But how are you guys exactly thinking about that? I mean, obviously you said you haven't decided on it yet and how it's going to work, but what are some like choices that you guys are thinking of there?
All right. Yeah, we've talked to a couple of different people that are working on this problem and ideating around it. And generally, it's an attribution issue. So, like, we can have a auction mechanism at the sequencer level to auction off the ability to propose blocks, right? Because we have a complete monopoly over block proposer in perpetuity if you have a single sequencer. We have a rotating sequencer, but basically same thing. And it's really a matter of just like, how do you make sure that if there are bundles and or like entire blocks being proposed and there's an aggregate level of MEV being bid, like how do you make sure that that is attributed correctly to the dApps that originated it, instead of say the users that originated. If the users, there's already a product by Flashbots called MevShare, where the MEV generated by a single transaction, if you use a specific RPC, you get a rebate, right? And so like we're still thinking about the exact construction, but it's mostly that attribution issue, and that might not be a solved problem, or a solvable problem. We're not sure yet at the moment, but it's something that I think will be highly interesting to dApps. Right, dApps want to accrue value, and I think basically people are moving to app chains not because they want to make core modifications to the execution environment or the virtual machine, or they want to make runtime modifications out of precompile. Like they basically want to accrue value, and they don't want their fees and their users to be messed with because there's another MEV generating event, or like a token mint or NFT mint that's on the base layer that is basically losing me users because of the fees, right? And so like if we solve for these two things, I think we have a great chance of basically keeping all dApps on the chain without giving them an incentive to leave to an app chain.
Thanks. All right, that makes sense. Ren and Terry, I mean, you guys kind of brought up this issue before, but I want to understand attracting users to the chain. I think like, yes, you have apps and you have, I guess, liquidity, and like you have a very performant execution layer. But one issue that I feel like you guys might face is the MetaMask snaps and Salmon wallet limitation. And I know you kind of mentioned that you're thinking of onboarding Solana wallets, but I want to understand like what that roadmap is like. Basically, I know Ren, you said you don't want me to ask founders what the roadmap is, but I do. Like this was something that I was thinking about quite a bit. Like, how is I assume you guys have some plans with wallets coming up.
Yeah. So currently on like testnet and devnet, a user can only use MetaMask snaps or a Salmon wallet. And there was something that you alluded to, right? There's sort of a problem with SVM chains in terms of chain IDs, where a malicious staff can basically request a signature for an Eclipse transaction, and then the simulation happens on the Eclipse networks. But then the staff submits the valid and signed transaction to Solana mainnet, because this sort of wallet can't tell the difference between like Eclipse's like SVM execution environment and like Solana's execution environment. And the TLDR said it's basically a new phishing attack vector. So we do want to put out some research and a proposal around that to solve this issue, both for ourselves and other potential SVM chains that will be launching. In terms of like the user experience side, I do think not as many people are familiar with MetaMask Snap or Salmon Wallet. We do have other wallet partners lined up that I cannot share right now, but I don't think Solana users should be too worried. I'll put it that way.
That's perfect. That's
Or should not be
exciting.
worried at all.
Perfect. One more thing, Terry. One thing you mentioned was your sequencer design. We have like obviously over the past few weeks we've had a lot of talk about sequencers. John Sharp's released like a 40-page report looking into sequencer designs, but I want to hear like how you guys are approaching that, because I mean you are a rollup, a new type of rollup, so I feel like that's the biggest topic now.
Yeah. Well, I have some like stronger opinions about this, and largely, like John's post was about, how based pre-confirmations will make it's like Solana with extra steps. There's a huge centralization vector with proposers doing pre-confirmations. And so if we're commenting on just the based sequencing part and or a shared sequencing part or layer that a lot of people have been showing interest in. Well, so the basic issue is that rollups introduce fragmentation to the end user. You have to add different chain IDs to your wallet. You have to interact and bridge across different chains. And in large part, like shared sequencing is a very difficult social issue. I think Justin Drake said on a podcast, it's not a technical issue, it's a social issue. But I think that's why it's very, very difficult to solve, right? Like every chain that has a lot of usage, a lot of dApps, a lot of users, has an incentive to launch their own shared sequencer, If I'm Arbitrum, like why would I ever opt into Optimism's super chain instead of just making my own orbit system? And some rebuttals to this have been that basically like shared sequencers will harvest cross-domain MEV at the shared sequencer level and then redistribute that back to constituent chains with some sort of attribution mechanism. But then, if you can also generalize that to say like I can build a shared sequencing mechanism that does that as Arbitrum as Optimism, right? So like from that perspective, I feel like every large chain has an incentive to build their own shared sequencer, which ends up resulting in these islands. So right now you have these sequencer islands or these roll-up islands, or the roll-up here, roll-up there, roll-up there. But then in the future, you're going to have something like shared sequencer there, shared sequencer there, shared sequencer. It's going to look almost exactly the same. You're going to be able to interoperate between like shards of a roll-up, right? And that kind of defeats the whole purpose of like, synchronous composability. And so the idea that Justin Drake had was like, okay, because it's impossible to get a social Schelling point with like a company building a shared sequencer, let's have the Ethereum like L1 proposer be the shared sequencer. But like there's a lot of issues with that, in that you can't get the same degree of performance. You're restricted to similar block times. That's where pre-confirmations comes in, but that's where there's all these other trust assumptions. There's all this other issues with MEV and centralization. Yeah, and so like that's where the Vitalik post came in, where he was arguing either you can spiritually and technologically be a base rollup where you subscribe to kind of the trade-offs that space has. You take that block time, you take what's possibly low latency, you take maybe out of protocol pre-confirmation guarantees, which might not be delivered in time and or result in centralizing forces. But you go with that, or you just go with a fast chain. You become a server with extra scaffolding, as he says. But in general, like once a chain, an L2, does not give an app chain incentive to leave, then you don't need a shared sequencer mechanism to interoperate between your ecosystem. And that's where we want to be. Like we want to be super scalable, have local theme markets to solve the noisy neighbor problem, and have value accrual back to the dApps. So the apps that are building on Eclipse don't have an incentive to go build their own app chain. Then we don't need to build our own shared sequencer.
That makes sense. I have two questions, but they're unrelated, so I'm going to ask the first one first. But then what you mentioned apps, but this was the question that I forgot about before. What apps do you guys envision? Like, I know you said you want to be unopinionated and that you don't want to decide, and that a lot of rollups kind of fail in that because they want to bring in like what happened in the past. But obviously, if you're building a very high performance chain, you have certain dApps that you want to attract. Is there anything like in your mind that you think is particularly suitable for Eclipse because it brings in the SVM and the liquidity together?
I think as far as what that looks like today, there's a good mix of apps between DeFi, consumer, NFTs, and I will be blunt in that a lot of like the dApps today and how the dApps function do not need the level of throughput that you see a lot on a lot of these like fast or high throughput chains, right? I want to be like very brutally honest about that. But if we basically scale to an order of magnitude larger user base, then these L2s will run into like a load of sort of throughput issues, right? So in terms of DeFi, consumer NFT apps, as far as where our ecosystem is today, there's a good mix of Solana blue chips. There's a good mix of some Eclipse native dApps. And I forgot to mention this just now, but we are going to be hosting a hackathon probably around the end of July or early August with 5 different verticals. And we hope to basically get like a bunch more interesting dApps there. As far as where we want to see dApps go in the future, obviously, as Terry mentioned, we want to remain sort of like agnostic and really just enabling builders to sort of build something that they think really provides value to users. But personally, I think some interesting ideas are, for example, devs that uniquely utilize like the parallel execution environment. So, for example, like there's AMMs today, and AMMs operate by sort of like living in this like gigantic like singleton contract. But with parallel execution, for example, you can build a sharded AMM where every liquidity pool is a separate contract. And with a sharded AMM construction, you basically enjoy like I think the paper said like a 5x higher like throughput within that AMM. So like ideas like this are really interesting. Personally, I also like to see more consumer breakout dApps. I think DeFi today is like pretty limited in terms of what you can do, especially like just trying to make money on meme coins. And I think consumer apps are slowly but surely taking off. You're seeing things like Blinks, you're seeing like things like Tipping, you're seeing things like ZK2B, which are a lot of these barriers to building proper consumer dApps slowly and slowly get broken down. And I think slowly and slowly consumer builders will realize that and build interesting dApps on chain. And hopefully we'll see some of that on Eclipse.
Terry, you brought up fragmentation. Obviously, I'm very concerned about it. You're concerned about it, and I think 99% of Ethereum is very concerned about it. How do you see like rollups evolve over the next few years?
Yeah, there's going to be a lot more rollups like us. We are the first, but basically rollups that acknowledge the fact that fragmentation is bad and try to become the Schelling point where all dApps can live. And that necessitates a couple things like local fee markets and fee redistribution. And instead of incentivizing app chains and then interoperating via shared sequencer, I think you're going to see a lot more very high performance rollups that can support the entirety of execution throughput that is required from their dApp base. I think it's naive for me to say that the future is going to look like one chain completely dominating the L2 landscape. That is obviously like where we'd want to be. But there will always be reasons for people to roll their own chain that doesn't have anything to do with value accrual, and it doesn't have anything to do with fee markets, right? It might be just like a cultural thing. People might want to do it for fun. People might want to actually make modifications to the runtime, and that's a legitimate reason for people to branch off into an app chain. And so those will always be incentives that are present.
That makes sense.
One thing that's interesting on the Solana roadmap is the possibility of multiple leaders, right? I'm just like curious, what do you guys think of that? And is that an advantage or disadvantage versus what Eclipse is building?
Yeah, so one advantage you have as a multiple leader is that, well, think about like proof of work. One great part of proof of work was that there's multiple people that are competing for proposal. And if that's the case, then you have much less incentive to play, monopolistic games that you can play because you are the monopoly for that slot, right? So things like timing games are much less feasible. For us, like there is an inherent trust assumption in relying on a centralized sequencer, especially if we are doing something like non-malicious MEV redistribution. And so like we expressly don't want to go toward a world where we don't have that element. Like we think that element, a trusted sequencer, except with strong censorship resistant guarantees and strong verifiability. So safety and liveness are always preserved, and there's a rotating set. Other than that, we think those are scaffolding enough to give people trust in being able to rely on one sequencer and being able to trust whoever operates that to not be malicious. And that gives us the affordances to really go hard on what is beneficial and what is possible with that construction, right? Which is increase the throughput as much as possible. And that's where we want to operate it. Like we want to differentiate on execution and everything related to the execution environment. And we don't really want to think too much or care or compete in those other dynamics of let's have a maximally decentralized proposer set, for example.
I think that's a good place to end it. Guys, Terry, Ren, thank you so much for coming on. Is there any place that I should direct my viewers to check out?
Yeah, definitely. You can find us on Twitter at EclipseFND or our website eclipse.xyz, and feel free to hop in there. I'm basically terminally online and more than happy to chat with anyone who's interested in building on Eclipse or just in general interested in learning more about Eclipse. But thank you so much for having us on, Baco. And thank you, Ryan, too.
Make sure to check out Ren's podcast as well, and make sure to check out their hackathon at the end of July, Ren.
Thank you for the show. Appreciate it.
All right. Have a good one. Are you currently building on Polygon or interested in migrating? Season 1 of the Polygon Community Grants Program is live right now and features $35 million in MATIC to support the next generation of Polygon projects. Builders on Polygon, these grants are for you. Join the aggregated future today by applying at polygon.technology/grants.